Good evening, everyone. Welcome to those of you online and here at the center. I want to start briefly tonight by first acknowledging the tragic accident we're all aware of that occurred last night at Reagan Airport, such a deeply saddening event. And we extend our condolences to all those communities impacted. My name is Zach Burton. I'm the director of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs Center here in Washington, D.C., and we're delighted to partner with NYU, the John Bradema Center here tonight. It's great to see many familiar faces. This evening, we're delighted to discuss In Defense of Partisanship, a book that takes on what is both, of course, the longstanding nature of our political system, but is also maybe the defining theme of American politics over the last decade. So to our featured guest, first I'll start with Julian Zelizer, who is one of our own at Princeton, and we're happy to lend him here tonight to NYU. He's professor of history and public affairs at Princeton, a CNN political analyst, and a regular voice on NPR. Julian was also a professor of mine while I was at Princeton and taught a great class on leadership. He's really among the best at translating American political history and drawing lessons and parallels to contemporary politics, which I'm sure he'll do here tonight. And this latest book is another timely contribution to the national conversation. Joining him tonight is Margaret Talev, another friend of ours, who is a senior contributor at Axios and the director of Syracuse University's Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship, and spent a long career herself reporting on the very issues we'll be talking about tonight. Before I turn it over to them, lastly, I want to extend an invitation to all of you to sign up for more events here at NYU. And also, if you go online, you can find the growing list of events at our center in DuPont Circle at the Princeton SPIA Center. With that, thanks again very much, everyone, for joining tonight. Julian, Margaret, over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for the warm intro. Thanks to all of you guys for turning out tonight before the snowstorm. I think it's going to be a rainstorm. And thanks to you for writing this book. I had so much fun reading this book. I learned a lot about American history, some things that I was embarrassed that I didn't know before. And for any of you who have not yet read this book, there are two great things about it. One is that it's really fun and easy to read, and two is that it's really short. So I guess I wanted to start our conversation tonight by asking you whether you actually still stand by the title of this, In Defense of Partisanship.
Even more now than today. I stand by it. The book isn't written for the moment, even though it's relevant to the moment. And I do believe that strong partisanship is practically what we're going to have in the next few decades. I think the divisions are real. I still think the value of party is very strong when it's done well. And I think if we are facing, if you agree that we're facing a threat of a very aggressive president who will deploy power in aggressive ways, in my mind, the importance of partisanship among Democrats, and I've written about this, is going to be instrumental at this point as one check to trying to fight back against that.
We should set the table a little bit. We're going to talk, but then all of you are not only going to have the chance to ask questions, but I hope you will ask questions, and I hope they'll be more insightful and smarter than mine. So maybe start thinking now about what, where you're like, why didn't you just ask him the obvious question? Keep that in your mind and we'll come to you. To your point, if I was going to do the cliff notes of what this book is about, not as a spoiler, I hope you'll all read it anyway, it's that partisanship is a good thing, but hyper-partisanship is a bad thing and a destructive thing. And that the two-party system not only has been the most dominant, but is the most likely to remain the most dominant, and that while democracy is flawed, it's also better than the other alternatives. So in other words, it's kind of like, it's sort of an OG. It's like, there's a reason why the system was built the way it was built, and it's unlikely to magically transform with the magic beans into something that people who believe in magical thinking are calling for. But if there is hyper-partisanship, does it matter that partisanship is good if what we have is hyper-partisanship?
Yeah, so there's different parts of the book. One part of the book is just a clear-eyed look at American history. We have a founding in this country that tries to prevent parties from forming. That is fundamental to the founders.
Say more about that.
Well, James Madison, one of his great fears was faction, which is a version of what we will call parties. George Washington, our first president, ends his presidency with a farewell address about the dangers of division, and the Constitution itself is designed to fracture our system, but we have parties from the start, including James Madison, who helped start the first party. So the clear-eyed look is partisanship in a two-party system has just been what we have had, and it's defined our democracy. A second is an argument it's actually served an important function. And I try to say, A, some of our moments of big ideas have come from strong parties, FDR and the Democrats and the New Deal, Ronald Reagan and the Republicans in the 1980s. Partisanship can produce sea changes in how we think about politics. And parties also help, as people have realized from the beginning, to connect this disjointed form of government that we have, this design where there's a million different veto points and levels of authority. They are a connective tissue. And finally, there's a realistic argument. I don't think it's going away. I think the divisions in this country are very real. And parties function to direct it when it's done well, direct that tension into the political system and have a fight in the system rather than outside it. Your final question, does it matter? Yes. I mean, I think if we have hyper-partisanship, which I think we do, which I define essentially as a partisanship where the guardrails have been thrown out in terms of what procedures could be weaponized, what you can say. Even the election system became yet one more part of partisan warfare. For me, the question is, how do we pull that back, but keep the divisions that aren't going away, rather than imagining a hypothetical where we all come together and just agree to agree.
The idea of partisanship may be constant throughout American history, but the idea of what those two parties in a two-party system each represent and how far apart they are from each other and whether they're like immutable or shapeshifters, that's changed many times. And we are now living through a period of time when it's changing, or I think it's already changed. Again, can you just sort of walk us through some of the greatest hits of the American two-party system? What the two parties have been and how their core bases have changed over time? Yeah,
I mean, one big shift you can see is within our own, so the last change to the two-party system is in the 19th century when we get the Republican Party instead of the Whig Party. And
that's the major modern political parties that, but they don't stand for the same stuff.
They don't stand for the same thing. So, one shift you keep seeing within parties is whether they're internally divided or not. And so you can contrast two eras, the period from the 30s to the 70s. Both parties were internally divided, deeply divided. Democrats were divided between northern liberals, people like a Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, supported civil rights, who supported health care reform, urban reform, and then you had southern Democrats who controlled the committees on Capitol Hill and worked with Republicans closely all the time to stop any progress on civil rights and to stop any progress on union expansion.
And just to underscore it, that was the Democratic Party.
That was the Southern Democrat, And then you had Republicans who were internally divided between liberal Northern Republicans like a Jacob Javits, who were, by today, they would be more liberal than AOC, by the standards of what they stood for. And then you had Midwestern Republicans like Everett Dirksen, who were pretty strong anti-government figures. So the parties were internally divided, whereas today, they're much more on the same page, even with the divisions we read about in terms of their voting on Capitol Hill. Roll call voting is pretty consistent. Ideologically, there's not the kinds of divisions that you had in that earlier period. So you have parties that look much more the same internally. That's one kind of shift that's happened. And obviously, Democrats have shifted from a government where a lot of the political weight was against many kinds of government to one where they have fully embraced the tradition of Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson.
There seems to be another irony in the sort of oeuvre of parties, which is that the share of Americans who would consider themselves independents has been larger in recent years than ever before, at least in our lifetimes and modern American history. And yet the idea that, at least in elections, the moderates or the center is, it's not that it's not there, but it's not organized and it can't wield itself. So how do those two things coexist? And do you think that moderation in each party is necessary in order for hyper-partisanship to revert to partisanship?
Well, in question one, I mean, some of these polls, which are pretty consistent, a lot of people who say they're independent or say they're centrist and don't like the parties then go back and vote for one of the parties. So that identification still works on election day, and that's really what matters. And parties are strong organizationally. They have a lot of muscle in terms of money. They have a lot of clout politically in terms of shaping the conversation. So I think they're just more dominant than maybe the handful of people who actually stand by going their own way around election day. That's why third parties historically and certainly today just have a lot of trouble gaining traction. So that's how I put those two together. And the bottom line is, I just think the forces of partisanship are much stronger than those stories that often come out about what will happen, will the independents change everything. Moderation, it means different things. I mean, some talk about moderation, maybe some people here think of that as moving to a policy center, moving to some kind of ideological center. I think the issue is different today, and I do talk more about the Republican Party than the Democratic Party, and I really pin the history there. But moderation means in terms of how you conduct your partisanship. And I think one of the changes in hyper-partisanship isn't that it's just about extreme policies, it's about extreme politics. And so you can take an example like the debt ceiling, which has now moved from in 2011 being a dramatic thing for legislators to seriously threaten, not raising the debt ceiling, to today.
It's baked in. The markets don't even react.
It's like government shutdowns. It's like not having a budget anymore. These are now normal tools.
Impeachments on the cusp of an
the whole thing.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, that's where the moderation is going to have to come. Because on the policy, there's a lot of issues I'm not sure that center really exists, frankly.
That's really interesting. Before we go to questions, I want to go back just a little bit in history. When was partisanship good? When did it work?
Well, I think it's worked. All the functions I say have worked throughout, even if it's distasteful, have worked throughout different periods of history. So, for example, in 1964 and 1965 is one of the most important periods of building government. And
the civil rights movement.
Great society, civil rights, voting rights, Medicare, Medicaid, federal aid for education, everything that might be gone in the next few weeks. Just kidding.
Are you?
JK. But it's a very productive, and yes, so people will say, well, Republicans ended up voting on some of that. There was bipartisan legislation, but that wasn't the drive. The drive was a Democratic Party that in 1964 devastates the Republicans. Lyndon Johnson runs against Barry Goldwater, and Goldwater is just decimated. Republicans, their numbers shrink on Capitol Hill. And so Democrats just drive those 2 years of policy making, and Republicans go along with some of it because they have no choice. And so that's a moment where you can see, as I said, with Reagan in the 80s, where parties have actually produced key moments of transformative policy making. Another moment I talk about, another virtue of parties, when they work well, and there's been a lot of comparative political science on this, they can become checks to excessive populism and authoritarianism. And
through the machine?
The party filters the worst elements of politics when they're doing well.
Are you feeling that right now?
Well, I can talk about the Republican Party and what's happened, so that's a separate issue. But an example from history is I think in the early 50s, you have a very serious reactionary force emerge with Senator Joseph McCarthy. And he does survive for a while, but ultimately the Republican Party in 1954 does clamp down on him and helps remove him from mainstream life. He does not become a leader of the Republican Party. And so that's an example of when a party does that. And finally, just look, throughout history, there's no specific moment other than bad moments like the Civil War. Parties have been how we have filtered divisions over tariffs, over the social safety net, over regulation. And so it's not one moment, but this is the kind of way in which a democracy, many people agree, has overall done pretty well. That's how the decisions have been made. And even when there's points of agreement, the parties are still kind of very forceful presence. So that's different than the last couple of decades, but that's how I see it.
Talked about the 1960s and the Democrats having leverage over the Republicans to push through some of these big changes to government and society that have persisted for 50 plus years, 60 years. We're in a moment now where the Republicans had a very dominant win, a popular vote and electoral college win in the presidential election, technically controlling Congress, a majority of Republican nominated judges on the Supreme Court, a forceful president who's not afraid to test the limits of executive power. Do you see or do you predict that a mirroring of what happened in the 1960s right now? Are we at a moment where there could be fundamental lasting changes to the size of government, the protections for civil service, the policies towards immigration, things that get locked in for 50 or 60 years?
So, yes, and you can do that with a narrow majority. And I mean, I have argued, and not everyone agrees with this, that at some level, President Trump understands partisanship instinctively. And he has actually leaned very heavily on the congressional wing of his party in the last few weeks, including in the selection of a speaker, to put unbearable pressure on the party so everyone's on the same page. And I do think they've already, on immigration, shifted the debate much further to the right than it was in 2016. And the Republican Party has shifted it to the right since the 90s in dramatic ways. And I think he has the potential now, the GOP has the potential to institutionalize a system focused on deportation, border control, and limiting access, and essentially jettisoning discussions of a pathway to citizenship for a long time to come. If he's able to kind of be skillful, and that's a big question with him.
Beyond immigration? Beyond
immigration, on social policy, dismantling environmental regulations, dismantling workplace regulations. They're hard to get back on the books. And I think that is the game plan. Doesn't mean it will work, but he has the potential to reverse a lot of what the government has done since the 1970s.
So not you, the historian, but you, the person living in the real world, might disagree with many of those outcomes, not think they're good for society. Why do you still feel that partisanship is good in that context when it achieves means that you might disagree with?
I mean, I will distinguish the kind of partisanship he practices epitomizes hyperpartisanship.
Okay.
So he is willing to do whatever is necessary. And many Republicans right now who have come of age in the last few years are also willing to do things which I think undermine our ability to govern, undermine the health of our democratic institutions. So I want to kind of make that very clear. This kind of partisanship, that is what I say is incredibly damaging. That said, look, I believe ultimately we want a system where if a party is able to win power and is able to figure out how to push through their agenda, even if I don't agree with that agenda, I think that is how our democracy works. And the other party will have a chance to do the same. And the other party, if they act in a partisan fashion, can block some of that. So I don't think it's a bad thing still. It's the kind of partisanship I'm seeing in the GOP that I find very destabilizing and dangerous.
Two questions, then we'll go to your questions. One, how do you think that social media and the sort of transformative thing where everybody is their own brand and where the individual is more powerful than the institution. How is that changing either the lasting nature of partisanship or whether partisanship is good or what we have today?
Yeah, I don't think the individualization, so to speak, of communications is broken party. I think parties have found a way to use the new communication world. So because it's a filterless world, and it's a world filled with a lot of partisan commentary, not you, but a lot of journalists, and podcasters are very open in their position. I think it's fueled the divisions, and it's kind of lent credence to people who are the most extreme in how they want to conduct the fight. It's also broken, I think, social media more than cable or more than online print kind of journalism like Axios. It's broken our public commons. So I always tell students that in the 1960s, the debate was over, do we stay in Vietnam and continue to fight, or do we withdraw troops? If you had the same war going on now, you would have people saying, nothing's happening in Vietnam, there is no war, and a lot of people would believe it. So I think that creates a lot of instability, and then you have intense partisan fighting. I think it's just kind of problematic that way. But I don't think it's actually undercut the partisanship, and I do think in ways it's fueled the hyperpartisanship.
The hyperpartisanship. My last question before your questions is actually not about partisanship, it's just about you. You are a prolific historian, not just a thinker about history, but a writer of history. And I think a lot of people, maybe it's just me, but also maybe a lot of people with us, would be curious about your process. And maybe this book is a typical example, but how did you actually write this book?
So my process in a nutshell is I work a lot. I like to have fun too, so I go out, but I'm very disciplined, and I literally write something every day.
And wait, what time? Like 4 a.m.? What time?
No, 4 a.m. I'm working out. So now you know
God.
a lot. So it's in the morning and afternoon, and I'm fortunate. This is not a skill. It's not hard for me to just jump into the writing, and I can write anywhere. I've written on subways and cabs. It doesn't really matter where. I've written on my phone, on notes. I can write so I'm constantly doing a little bit all the time, and I'm always thinking about it. That's my process, and I love it. So it's not a process, but for me, this is not a burden. I have so much fun working on these books. This book was a little different, and I was approached, it's a series that Nick Lemon of The New Yorker edits. And it's mostly journalists write these, and they're meant to be short, big picture, provocative books about things that are going on in politics and the economy. And he asked me to write it, and I'm working on another book at the same time. I'm still working on it.
So you're doing you were doing this and another book.
Yes.
Okay, what's the other book about? Is it a secret?
No.
Okay.
It's about something called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which is a civil rights group in '64, and their clash with Lyndon Johnson.
So a very specific book about a specific moment in time, and then this sweeping, explain America then and now.
Yeah, okay. And so he asked me to do it, and I was intrigued. And I said, okay, I'll do it. I didn't think it through totally. And I sat down and I started writing, this is fun to do and interesting. And one thing I did, which I mentioned to you, I wrote the whole thing, and usually I have notes and I go to archives, and I just sat at a desk and just wrote the book out of my head. And part of why I could do that, this brings together things I've been working on throughout my career. Literally,
it's 175 pages.
Yeah, no, it's a lot.
Okay.
But since my dissertation was on this guy Wilbur Mills, who some of you here know is the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, involved in a big scandal. But it was about Congress. It was about this bipartisan coalition people hated in the 1950s and 60s. And then I wrote about Newt Gingrich, and I wrote about Johnson and the Great Society. So it's bringing together all these things, but doing it succinctly, it turned
so like
really
you
fun.
worked out at 4 a.m, and then you just were like, oh, I'm going to write a book today, and you sat
Yeah,
down and you wrote it?
you got it.
Did you take bathroom breaks, or you just like the astronaut?
I take breaks all the time. I walk around. I'm a very fidgety guy.
Okay.
So I don't have
just
much.
banged it out.
I wish there was a bigger process, but I just sat and
You wrote 175 pages in one day?
Yeah. No, not in one day. No, not
okay.
in one day. Oh my God, no. It was a couple months of doing it.
It was a couple days.
So I wrote a draft, and then I went and I looked for, things and studies on specific parts of the book to see what was going on. And the hardest part was the last part when Nick told me, you have to have a chapter on reforming the system. Like, what do you do?
So solution. He wanted your idea for solutions.
Right, and I'm the historian, and the best part of being a historian, you just kind of write about how things got messy, and then you mic drop and walk away.
Right.
And you have to deal with it.
No, I don't do the solutions.
No, you don't either,
I ask other people what the solutions
But it was actually really fun, and it kind of, that was a little more reading into things that I'm aware of, but it's not what I'm focused on.
Can you tell us what the solution is, or does everyone have to read it?
Everyone has to read it, but I can just say broad. I mean, I focus on procedural reforms, I focus on leadership reforms, and I focus on reforms about how parties work, mechanisms people are experimenting with to connect voters to parties in a different way. And I work through all of those. So that's my process. It's not very exciting, I must say.
I actually think writing most of the book in one day actually is pretty exciting. Okay, we are going to go to you guys. I just want to also let everyone else know that this book was actually written well before the November election. Did you try to game out like a book that would work either way, or how did you think about the fact that you would be done before the outcome was known, but published after the outcome was known?
One thing I have learned in my career, which is now long because I'm old, is not to do that. And I never write books ever, although they're building off issues of the moment. I don't write them kind of thinking, all right, it's coming out this period, and I want to speak to some kind of outcome, because it's unpredictable. I don't even do that with my op-eds. I mean, I've learned not to try to do that, because or else you're always off a little. So you have to write a point you want to make, and you see where it falls. And so I didn't think of this book in terms of 2024. The publishers think of when do you put it out, but I didn't write it. I wanted to write a bigger argument about this kind of constant aversion to partisanship in an era where it's so obvious that we are in an intensely partisan period. And how do we understand how we got here? And how do we look back at the history of people who have made arguments in favor of partisanship, from Woodrow Wilson to political scientists in the 50s. Now I guess I'm part of that. And provide people some sense of a different way of thinking of this, and to distinguish it from what we've seen in the last 10, 15 years. The election was coming, I knew that, but I didn't write it for that, and it doesn't really change the book.
You feel more or less optimistic about the future of the country after putting yourself through the paces of reminding yourself about what's happened already in the history of this country?
Yeah, and I guess the exercise of the book also, and some people have noted, it is pragmatic in some ways. I'm not making the grandiose arguments that everything's perfect, nor am I saying let's shift to some nonpartisan system. I'm trying to say we need to think seriously, even in the chaos that we live through, about what are concrete steps we can take to make the system better.
To make it work.
Thinking that way I find actually helpful, and I think that's how we actually have to approach some of these problems.
Great. Let's do questions. All right, put your hand up. Mike's going to come to you. If you're open to it, share your name with us and ask a brilliant question. Can we go to the middle here first?
Hi, I'm Ashley Scott. I was Princeton class of 21 and now work in the nonprofit sector. I was really interested, I have many questions, but would like to focus on one area. You talked about sort of social media, about the era that we're in now, and something that I always try to emphasize to our elders, people who have come before us. I am an older member of Gen Z. And so I can speak on behalf of my generation that we have only voted in elections where Donald Trump, presidential elections, where Donald Trump has been on the ballot. And so I'm wondering sort of how you think about looking to the past for examples of teaching a generation who has come up in an era of hyperpartisanship, in an era where social media has broken the public square, like you said, in order to help get us back to sort of regular levels of partisanship when our generation has never sort of been cognizant during those regular levels? Thank you.
Well, no, I mean, that's a great question, and that's what I try to do in many of my classes, frankly, and that is a virtue of not just old history, but recent history. So you can even teach, I teach a lot about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was incredibly controversial. He was not, now he's been remade nostalgically into this person everyone loved, but he was pushing policies that were really kind of shattering some ideas that liberals had had for decades. But he was still working within normal governing processes. He wasn't taking steps, even if you didn't like his policies, that literally put us on the brink of overturning an election, as an example. He can be seen as a way in which you can understand how the controversies that come with party can exist, but the democracy itself doesn't have to be thrown overboard. And you can see this with Democratic presidents. Certainly, Lyndon Johnson, who we've talked about, was the same way. I mean, he was pushing. Look, with civil rights, you had a president, some people forget, who was pushing, finally, for legislation that would destabilize and was incredibly threatening to the racial order of the South and to the country more broadly, but in particular, at first, to the Deep South. And yet he was also doing that through the committee system. Legislators on Capitol Hill, liberals who hated that bipartisan coalition, what do? They were organizing, they were vote counting, they were using established mechanisms, like something called the discharge petition, to put pressure to break the back of the conservatives. And so there's lots of examples until recent years where you can find that. You can also go back, if you want bad examples, to the Civil War of what happens when dysfunction is victorious. So that's how I teach history, but I do worry also with journalism. I try to teach the history of journalism and to really capture how much it's changed without being nostalgic, also showing that there were a lot of problems with journalism throughout history. Yeah. But I actually feel more of a, not pressure, but more of an urgency to do that because of what you said. It is incredible. It's not simply Donald Trump, though. They have grown up in an era where all of this, from the way social media works to the Tea Party and the debt ceiling fights to, they don't even blink, a lot of students. If you say, the government might shut down next week, I don't think a lot of students would think that's very interesting at all. But in 95, it was a big story. Even 95 is interesting to go back to because it was a big thing when the government shut down. And that's good to remember and study that it was a big thing. I just talked about Nixon today resigning. It was a big thing for a president to be impeached and for Congress to decide that is worthwhile. And history needs to bring back that sense of how politics could work.
We're going to go up there. One of the things that I've heard in recent weeks from pollsters and the survey research community is real concern about what the younger generation at least says is their attitude towards CEOs after the killing of the United Healthcare CEO, the idea that younger people are a little bit more cavalier about, and I think it has to do with reduced trust in institutions and kind of almost like a numbing about sort of the humanity of individual. Like it's another generational thing to contend with. And it's hard to impose a norm of a past generation on a norm of a new generation. So I loved the question. All right, we had a question up here. God, we have so many questions. Maybe over here, and then up here, and then here.
Thank you. My name's Henry Schiffman. I'd like to know, in an era of hyperpartisanship, where the executive is seeking power and bypassing the normal institutions of government, would it be helpful to have a new center that's identifiable to defend the rule of law?
Well, it would be good to have a party defending the rule of law. I think what you're having right now is a president, you have a version of Richard Nixon. And I mean that, by that I mean a president who is very, very bold in his understanding and the people who surround him of what presidential power is, and not so concerned with the constitutional limitations on presidential power. But you have a party on the Hill. One way is to say the Republicans are essentially deferring and giving up, which some stories talk about. Another is they're supporting it. They are giving him the firewall he needs to do this. And I think you look at a lot of the confirmations, that's exactly what's happening. I don't see that as just delegation. I think one party is essentially at this point okay with that version of presidential power. So one option would be some new center forms that defends the rule of law. That would be good. Another is that you have a very effective opposition party. You know, this happened to some extent with Speaker Pelosi in 2005 and 2006. The Democrats were in a minority, but Democrats were very effective. They remained united. They had clear messaging, and they were pretty forceful in fighting back against what the party at the time saw was bad moves by the Bush administration. They did it they didn't kind of try to overturn processes. They worked within them. So an opposition party can also be the answer, but we need, yes, one of those two, defending the rule of law and defending norms of governing. It's not just the rule of law. Stable norms of governing is essential right now. And I don't know how it will play out. Again, teaching about Nixon, I was literally teaching about Nixon and impoundment today, and how Caspar Weinberger was suggesting and arguing to Nixon that constitutional limitations on impoundment were bogus, essentially. And so you're reading this, and I'm sure it sounded to the students that I was just doing a message, but I wasn't. This was written a long time ago. But right now, the party has coalesced around that vision. And so something has to kind of push back against that. I just don't think a center is going to form. I'm not optimistic. I think a better option at this point, and it's not that, I don't mean this as a partisan argument. I'm talking about defending the rule of law, will have to come from the Democratic Party.
Okay, you decide. I can't decide anymore. Where do you want to go?
Katrina McLaughlin, thanks for the talk today. First question is, in the historical analysis, when parties have shifted significantly or a new party has arisen, does that tend to come from the political elites or the low-level party folks and the public? And then if I'm allowed a second, just any words of advice or recommendation for both the Democrats and Republicans of today?
Well, on the first one, there's not a lot of examples, as we said, where this has happened. In the 19th century, you do have changes in parties. It's pretty elite-driven, and we didn't even have full suffrage when the parties were still actually shifting and new parties were successful. And we've had this Republican-Democratic system now, Democratic Party system since the 1860s, and the shifts we're talking about within parties are both. I mean, look, the Democrats moving away from that Southern base, which on race was very reactionary, required civil rights activists and union activists and grassroots pressure on the party leadership to move against this deference to Southern committee chairs and Southern party bosses. But it also required elites like a Hubert Humphrey, I consider him an elite, or organizations like the Americans for Democratic Action, or labor lawyers like Joe Rao, to actually be courageous and work with those groups to move the party in a new direction. Same in the 70s with Republicans. You had a huge mobilization of a conservative movement in the 70s that was grassroots, true, rooted in the evangelical church and more. But you also had people like Reagan, who is an elite, who capitalized and figured out how to actually move his own party. So it's a combination of both. And the second one, the advice, just remind me what the advice is that you want.
Any words you would say to the Democratic Party?
Yeah. I mean, look, I wrote an op-ed, so it's out there in the New Republic, that I do think Democrats have to be partisan right now. Just as strategic, I think the idea of working with the administration will not work politically, and they will end up fueling some of the problems we're talking about. There is a need for an opposition party right now, a strong opposition party. And that being strong does not entail replicating what the opposition, their opposition is doing. It means being a very united team at this point and thinking of very clear messages and picking priorities, leaving other issues to the side, but the priorities they pick fighting with hammer and tongue. I think that's essential right now. And the Republican Party, yes, I mean, I don't think it's gonna happen. I keep saying that, but there does have to come a moment when Republicans understand that some of what's happened in the last few years, it's not good for the democracy, it's not good for the party. And that at some point there will be a demand for generational change, I hope. And I don't see that yet, but I think that's what's gonna happen. That's a more wholesale reform that has to happen.
Great, thank you, Polly. Hi, I teach here at NYU, so I'm on the faculty here. I'm Professor David Ahn, PhD. I teach political economy. So thank you so much for the conversation. Really appreciate it. I also appreciate the tips about being able to write everywhere. I wish I could do that, so I learned from that as well.
You have to work out at 4 a.m., so that's actually how that works.
Right,
yeah.
and right on the subway. But a quick comment and then into question. Comment is, I really appreciate the overview of the history, looking back to the framers of the Constitution. And I want to bring in a bit of a political science, comparative politics explanation of the kind of diminished third party or lack of a third party, quite simply in the comparative politics literature. Mm-hmm. It seems to me the elephant in the room is the Duverger's law, which is that in a presidential system, it favors going in the direction of a two-party system. But in a parliamentary system, you can have multi-party, 4, 6, 8. But in a presidential system, institutionally, you vote for a third party and you're throwing away your vote, right? So that to me seems quite parsimonious and Occam's razor. Just want to throw that out there because that's what I'm thinking when we talk about partisanship. But leading into my question, you mentioned that the opposition, the Democratic Party, could be more of that check against the current administration. Yet we also talked about how the Republican Party is so dominant across the separation of powers. So you mentioned a little about Nancy Pelosi. I'm wondering like how, other thoughts about how the Democrats could be more of that check. Mm-hmm. Is it more at the local level? Is it that there's just all this in the news and outside of government, there's just gonna be mobilization where people are just gonna go vote against the current incumbent 4 years, 8 years later? Some thoughts about that. Thank you.
So
or midterms in 2 years, right?
Midterms, right. So on the other part, so yes, the strength of the presidency and focus on the presidency has certainly cemented the two-party system over parliamentary. So I talk about Woodrow Wilson, who was one of the first people to really write about the importance of party in the 1880s, and he gradually abandoned hopes for a parliamentary system and focused on a presidential party system where the president's the head but coordinates with Congress. The Electoral College is the obvious other institutional force because parties have to get their name on all the states, and that's very hard. And parties, the existing parties, have all the money and human power necessary to do that. Third parties can't really do it. So that is all very true. And in terms of the opposition, yes, Republicans are dominant, but they still live in this world, Republicans right now, a very narrow, the narrowest congressional majority in the House majority since 1931, barely a majority in the Senate. They did not jettison the filibuster for legislation. I think a lot of Democrats don't like the filibuster. I don't actually think it's a great thing, but they have it right now. So it's not as if they have a kind of open field to do whatever they want. And if the Democrats can remain on the same page, they will cause fractures in the Republican Party. Not huge ones, but all they have to do is peel off a few votes. So in terms of the next 2 years, I think there's actually a lot Democrats can do. Some of this is going to happen from blowback, from actual seeing what the administration is trying to do. Right. And it often, look, right now, Senate Republicans were part of the reason this funding freeze was rescinded, because they were like, what are you actually going to do? You're going to cut money for red state hospitals and red state universities. I think a lot of that will play out, and combined with a strong Democratic Party can check them. And then the midterms are going to be hard, but they are two years away. And that is a first step that can happen. If Democrats reclaim the House, that would be a big deal in terms of reestablishing a base of power. So there's a lot that can be done. And this is not 1964. This is not 1972. This is not 1936. We don't live in a world where anyone gets a huge majority anymore. We live in a world where presidents win, even this election. He won the swing states, but it was still that same red-blue map. And in Congress, we still live in an era of slim majorities and changing majorities. We no longer in a world where one party controls everything. So that's an underlying instability that the Republican coalition has to contend with. They might do well with it, but it isn't impossible to imagine this starting to erode.
Before we go to the next question, I want to ask a follow-up question to your question a couple questions ago, which is maybe there's not going to be a third center party or something like that, but do you believe that in order for whatever the opposition party is at any given point in time, and in this moment it would be the Democratic Party, that in order for that opposition party to be not only unified but strong and have leverage and force change or be a bulwark or whatever it is, do they need to capture the center, the American center, or can they just be off in baseland and still get it done?
Yeah, I mean, the Democrats don't tend to go off in baseland, to be honest. I don't see the party that way. They have a base, but the leadership, it still comes back to the Bidens and the Schumers, which is far from the base.
Do you need the working class to be a successful opposition
party? Yeah, they do. And they do, look, I think that's very clear. I actually think on that question, a Democratic Party that could convincingly talk and emphasize very traditional Democratic policies would have something to sell. I mean, the question is, can you win constituency over on the pocketbook rather than the kind of ideology?
Back to the future.
And that's what Democrats need to do, but that's not about moving to the base, nor is it about a center. That's actually, Democrats always had a broad coalitional argument that they would be the party to provide economic security. They would be the party to provide what historians talk about a moral capitalism, a capitalism with limits on the kind of risk that you've had. That's what the party has been about. And I think that's what they have to actually sell, and I think that could still be effective.
Now you don't even have to read the last chapter of the book. You just did it. So, all right, we got time for a couple more. Yes, over to you.
Thank you. My name is Jordan, and I was also a student in your leadership class.
Hey, how are you?
Yeah, so really nice to be back. My question is this: at the risk of asking such a partisan question, it's not too often I have the opportunity to talk to a scholar. The elite consensus is that Republicans are the ones who are smashing norms and leading to this era of hyper-partisanship, and yet Republicans will say, well, it was Democrats who got rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court justices, and it's Democrats who are weaponizing government by going after the Trump administration. And I'm wondering what your thought is of which party is responsible for this breakdown of normal politics and breaking all these norms. Is it a pox in both their houses, or is one more responsible?
No, I don't see the history. I do see the history is very different. I mean, I see a history, and again, this is not meant to be a partisan statement, but just looking at the two parties, how they developed since the 80s, I do think this has been a Republican-driven story. And I think there's a reason. It makes sense to me. It's not a mystery. It's not an ethical issue. Democrats are a party that ultimately believes in government and the use of government to deal with problems. Democrats as a whole can't afford to make government totally dysfunctional and to render governance impossible, because then their major platform is gone. Republicans, since Reagan, since that inauguration speech, have been very clear that government's the problem and are much more comfortable living with dysfunction. So it's created a space where I think the party has been willing to go much, much further, from Newt Gingrich to the Tea Party to Donald Trump. I see a trajectory. And I think that's where the weight of this has been in terms of prioritizing partisanship without guardrails and really downplaying other concerns of politicians, which include governing and which include the health of our institutions, which in the 50s and 60s was something politicians still really cared a lot about. This doesn't mean Democrats don't engage in some of this. I think there's fair criticism. I don't actually think I think the filibuster has been a tool of partisanship, to be honest, as it became a normalized weapon after the 70s. So I'm not convinced that removal is a key part of the story, nor is it equivalent to reforming the filibuster is not the same as playing around with the debt ceiling. Those are two fundamentally different things. And reforming the filibuster is not the equivalent of saying we will not even meet with the nominee of the president for the Supreme Court. Reference Merrick Garland and President Obama. So I think, look, I tell people as another kind of comparison, for me, the history of the parties is you have one party they're playing chess, and one party's very aggressive, they want to win, they're strategic, and they're sitting at the board trying to figure out how to beat the other person. And then you have the other party, the way the party has evolved, where they're playing for a while and then they just throw the board on the floor and say, I win. And so that's two very different kinds of partisanship and politics. I do think, I mean, there is an interesting debate now about the pardons, for example, under former President Biden, and whether the atmosphere now is almost goading Democrats into doing some of this in response or in a defensive posture. But I'm not convinced still that the Democrats are replicating what the Republicans are doing. And look, a lot of Republicans, I mean, at some level, they're pretty open about the kind of politics they practice. And so I don't see this as equivalent.
We have time for one more question. Make it count. Who's got it?
She just scared everyone. There we go.
Hi, my name's Brian, and well, professionally I'm a geographer, so my question actually comes out of redistricting. Is nonpartisan redistricting a possibility that actually blunts hyperpartisanship? And in the current environment, will it ever happen?
Good question. I talk about that in part of the book. First of all, there have been reforms to districting, and some states have attempted bipartisan redistricting bodies to decide, or nonpartisan. It hasn't been perfect. There's been, in New York, for example, there was a lot of blowback to some of the ways in which districts were created. It's also just something that will affect the House. I mean, political scientists warn against thinking redistricting reform is the cure-all, because it doesn't explain the partisanship in the Senate. It doesn't explain the partisanship in presidential politics. It doesn't explain the partisanship more broadly. So they warn, even if you somehow crafted this perfect system that created very competitive districts, that it would have limited effect. That said, it's not nothing. And I don't think it will create bipartisanship, but it could be a tempering mechanism, meaning if states effectively were able to create processes of creating districts that are more competitive, a strong Democrat or a strong Republican in the House would still have to think more broadly about what they do and possibly temper some of their politics. So I think ideally it's not a bad thing. I'm a little skeptical how much you get from it and how successful ultimately it will be. We've been doing this for many, many I mean, since 19th century, we've been doing it through the party. So it's hard to break that, but it's part of a reform package rather than the cure-all. It's the same with kind of, proportional elections, which some very smart people write about, not doing a winner-take-all, essentially, in districts, which also could be good, and it could give parties that lose some kind of power. But again, just to start, you're only dealing with the House, and it's unclear to me, even within the House, how total those reforms will be.
And corollary to both of those alternatives, what about the idea of expanding the number of House seats so that it's just more representative democracy?
Yeah.
So maybe it's harder to be hyper-partisan if you actually have to see some of the people in your district.
I favor that. That's one of the reforms I talk about. I think expanding the House, and it wasn't something I had thought about that much. I'm persuaded it's a good idea. And it is about, ultimately, you have districts today that are so large compared to where they were when the House number was set, it doesn't really make sense. And you have members of the House are dealing with huge populations, and so it's a good thing if they're smaller and there can be more contact. You don't exactly know the outcome, but I think inherently the more contact you have between members and the people who are being affected by what they do, it's good. And Danielle Allen, who's a very smart political scientist, added, she's a proponent of this, and she also, she wrote this article, she consulted with architects and stuff to see is it physically possible, and reached the conclusion it wouldn't be prohibitive. So I'm in favor of that. I think that's a good thing.
There's a skylight in every district.
Yeah,
It's
so
beautiful.
I think a bigger house would be better.
The bad news is you cannot line up to buy a signed copy of this here tonight. This event is not supporting that, but the good news is you will be getting an email with easy links if you would like a copy of this book. Again, I'm way too ADD to read a lot of 600-page tomes, although I always read your books. But this one is fun. You can take it on the metro. When you work out at 4 a.m., you can be on the elliptical reading this. Anyway, congratulations.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to see a lot of you.